Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrian and Dirk Willem, for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be back at ODI and to talk about this subject, which I think is of real interest to all of us. The rise of Asia from a kind of a backwater to the global factory within, I guess, 4 or 5 decades is seen as an economic miracle. We had, Korea, Taiwan, and some of the other countries from that bit, which came out in the 60s and 70s. And then the last 2 decades, we've seen the rise of China, particularly, but also India. And so, people see these series of linked industrial revolutions as something that has, changed the way in which Asia's geography and its economic importance in the world is come about. Now, some talk about this as the kind of Asian century, the 21st century, with China overtaking the United States within a very short period of time as becoming the largest economy. And so this has enormous implications for all of us in this room, and particularly for the UK and Europe, and also for Africa, of course. And I apologize for not putting Africa in the title. I've been sort of focusing very much on the central relationships, if you like, but of course the spillovers are very important, and I'm sure Matsuma is far more qualified than I to talk about those things. Now, the real question is how Europe and the UK may forge closer ties to mutual advantage. And the presentation that I am giving you today is really a synthesis of different things that I've done. And it's also talking about Asian regionalism, on which there are some published things. And I want to bring the European angle as kind of work in progress. And I want to try to deal with 3 things that may be of some interest to us. Where do we stand today on this Asia-Europe relationship in terms of integration and market-led opportunities in particular? Second, I want to talk a bit about the emerging challenges, but just to sort of set that as a kind of a scorecard out there as things we've got to look at. And then talk about some of the emerging policy issues which I think can help mitigate those challenges. And I'll give you a sense of my litmus test, if you like, of what the strength of those policy processes going forward and how we might try to tackle that. And then I want to sort of end with a kind of a way forward, how one sees the next few years emerging. So it's a kind of an exploratory talk. I'm going to do this in a synthetic kind of stylized manner, which people always like doing. I want to leave you with a few kind of potted thoughts, which I tried to do this morning. The first is we have this new era. The way we're doing business today in the world is going to be very different to how people did it before, and how we might do it in the next decade is going to be even more different. But the main kind of message is this rising Asia, which is also increasingly integrated amongst itself in the way Europe began to integrate a couple of decades ago, can kind of help rebalancing of the world economy towards kind of more demand from Asia and growth from Asia, particularly at a time when the developed world is sort of in a sort of stagnant trajectory. In the United States and in Europe, with the debt issue, the prospects look quite bleak, and there's indeed some talk about a double-dip recession, which is very worrying for everybody. And Asia appears to be growing, 5, 6, 7%, depending on the country, depending on what assumptions you make for the near term. So that's very important, and can also help the growing middle class in Asia. We're thinking of middle class of about the size of somewhere between 80 and 100, 150 million people, and that's a huge source of new demand. India, China, but also Indonesia and other countries, and so there are some big changes that can occur as a result of that. The growing ties are visible, and it's market-led. I mean, the market-led side, it's on the investment side, but also on the trade side. And I'm going to give you some numbers in a minute. Are good for the UK and good for Europe in general. And there's a scope for more ties to come, and I'll give you some sense of that. There are some stumbling blocks that we can talk about. The exchange rate is one, intellectual property is another, etc., etc., etc. And those are potential sticking points, and I think need to be handled with care and need a lot of policy attention, particularly in the UK, but also in Europe. And I think an old style of doing this in a ham-handed way is just not going to work in Asia. I can tell you that very, very simply off, because these new powers have a particular agenda, have a particular view of the world, and I think we need to handle these things in a very delicate manner. But I think progress can be made on those topics. And I think in terms of going forward, there are 3 kinds of vehicles, if you like. Free trade agreements, I think, are very important, particularly the Europe-Korea agreement is a very important kind of landmark. The aid for trade process, I think, is very important for Europe to re-engage with the bits of Asia that are not doing so well. We just talk about China and India, but actually there are 22 LDCs, small states, and a whole lot of other countries that are underperforming. And I feel that Europe and the UK are perhaps neglecting those countries. And I think that's to the peril of Europe and the UK in particular in the future. And then there's the ASIM process, on which there was a lot of attention. And Dirk Willem just reminded me there was a meeting in Brussels a few days ago. But when you compare that with the way the Americans are engaging or trying to engage in Asia through the APEC process and Obama's new emphasis on the Trans-Pacific Agreement, you see a qualitative and quantitative difference. And I think Europe is at risk of being left behind as America regains and then sees its own priorities. So I think we need to look at some of those things very briefly. And then, the bottom line, whatever else we do or don't do on those priorities, we must avoid protectionism. We must avoid inward orientation because it's very easy in the face of rising powers to take those kinds of stands. And I think that would be to the detriment of everyone. And we risk then going into a double-dip recession plus trade wars and issues of that kind, which I'm sure many of us would like to try to avoid. So the future really is bright if we do the right things now. And I think there is a very clear evolving agenda, and I hope this meeting will shed some light on that. So that's the kind of broad sense, but I'm going to try to cover these things quite briefly. So the first topic is, where are we today? So Asia's, rise, a lot of you are very familiar with, but Asia is about a third of world output, as of now. And if you look at the other bits, you see where they stand. And Asia and Europe really are the two big blocks in the world today, with North America, of course, still very important in terms of economic size and other variables. The really key aspect, not just being important in terms of trade and investment, industrialization, is the fact that we had this recession in the last couple of years, and that Asia has kind of bounced back. And a lot of people are very interested in why Asia bounced back. And the storyline is a very simple one. Asia had its shock in the 97-98 crisis, and during that time, Asia rebuilt its manufacturing sector, so it became much more competitive, much more lean and mean, and these production networks, which link large firms and small firms across Asia in the key industries, became very strong. And also Asia cleaned up its financial sector substantially with not just better institutions and attempts to develop the bond market, but also with better regulation. So Asia in that sense was in a slightly better position when the demand shock came. And of course there was a downturn, but the upturn for some of the countries seems to be there. But Asia hasn't decoupled. I mean, decoupling is a myth. Asia still depends very much on the final demand from Europe and the United States, although China and India in particular are coming out very strong. So Asia really needs, we need an independent world. This is not one where Asia can drive the rest of the world economy. And I think we're very far from that. Now that bit of the story all know, and we have many risks to the outlook that are coming about. We're very worried about the debt situation that is there in the world economy. We're also very worried about the possibilities of protectionism, which is a serious issue. And we're also worried about whether these fiscal stimulus packages get unwound too early. And those are real risks that we have to contend with. And then there is the financial regulation. If it's ham-handed, countries like the UK and others may lose banks. If it's done in a sensible manner, there are advantages that could be get from a service-based economy. So in a way, the prospects are going to be a little bit tricky in the few years to come, with probably slower growth than we might expect, and considerable stress, as we can all imagine. The other bit about Asia, which is very interesting, and this slide shows you interregional trade shares of different kind of blocks. And there's ASEAN in blue. And there is a larger grouping that involves Korea, China, Japan, Taipei, China, and others. And the basic story is about half of this broader Asia's trade and investment is with itself. And this is the production network story about these networks which are established in Asia around China to start with, but increasingly the inputs and the outputs are kind of being produced and sourced in the region and feeding this growing middle class. Right? So this is very important. Asia is not decoupling, but Asia is doing a lot more with itself. And ASEAN in particular was always thought to not have much integration. We see a quarter of its trade is with itself. And as ASEAN goes towards the single market and economy plan that they have in 2015, those ratios may rise some more. So this is a very interesting kind of harboring of what's happening in Asia. Similar figures for Europe are somewhere in between the numbers for ASEAN and etc. I think 40–50% of Europe's trade in these moments with itself. So that's the kind of benchmark people take. Now this Asia is not a closed economy by any means. It's fairly open regionalism, and one bit of that open regionalism is manifest in the growing trade relations with Europe. And I have some numbers that really show, I think this is $1 trillion something trade between East Asia and Europe. And those numbers are up quite significantly from before. And as you'd expect, you know, the key countries in Europe, Germany, France, and the UK are the major players in this kind of game. And you know, the good news is that trade is very dynamic, it's very buoyant, it's happening as two-way trade, and it's mutually beneficial to everyone concerned. And there are particular specializations in that trade. Increasingly, East Asia is doing manufactured goods, particularly the electronics and the auto industries, which are concentrated. Europe is increasingly a supplier of services of different kinds, but also very high-end manufacturing and high-end design and so on. So there's a very classic pattern of specialization in trade according to comparative advantage. And of course, it's an evolving one. And the challenge for Europe is really to keep reinventing the advantages in a coherent manner as we move down the track. UK, of course, has seen advantages as we go through this, and these are numbers from the International Trade Center, and essentially what you're getting is a lot of emphasis now on China and India. That's what I just wanted to kind of give you as a snapshot. And others around this room will know much better the detailed trade pattern in the UK with these countries, but here is kind of how it kind of pans out. And China and India are becoming really important in the UK's trade, along with Russian Federation, but I guess that's mostly all. This is what the international data show. Now, UK FDI in Asia, so it's really investment-led trade. I mean, that's really kind of very important. And those numbers are quite big. The UK is one of the leading investors in China. There are enormous investments. Till you start looking at the detail, you don't understand. And so when people say, well, all the trade balance is in favor of us, they forget the investment story, which is very important. And again, the same thing I saw with France. There is a city in China that has something like French companies employing 500,000 Chinese workers. And you know, so there's huge investment linkages which are understated. And this trade is really very much investment-led. So one is to kind of break this down into what's going on. And there are some examples there. The other way around, also investment is occurring. And we know a lot about some of these traditional investments, the shoes and the processed foods and things like that. But this is probably interesting. India is currently the second largest investor in Britain today. There's this little car that Tata has come up with, and this is the shape of the future. You know, one can see this car, this nano motor car that's ostensibly assembled in India with bits and pieces from China, bits and pieces from Europe, bits and pieces from Germany, and so on, and you know, UK design perhaps, or UK financing of such a venture. So one can see increasingly this type of integration occurring, and I think the UK has to look very carefully at some of these new sectors and industries and think about how it wants to develop those advantages and link up the globalized world. So it's occurring in a very dynamic manner, and the logic of why this is occurring should not be surprising, because Asia and Europe are very complementary, and here's some sense of the complementarity, which explain those trade and investment flows and the opportunities I talked about. And some of that is, you know, the fact that Asia is fast and dynamic and very, very rapidly growing with this big market, particularly in the middle class. We've got these deep production networks in key industries that have developed in manufacturing that are quite sophisticated, and also Asia is now integrating much more with itself through FDI activity. Now, where Europe really fits in is that it is a hugely integrated economy with very sophisticated technology and leading multinationals. It's also a center of innovation and skills, and therefore the comparative advantages between the two regions are very, very clear. And therefore, one feels that the ASEAN process really should make much more of what exists in the way that things might occur. It's almost a more natural economic entity than necessarily the US with Asia, the way one sees it. That has a lot of history to it and a lot of issues, but I think Asia-Europe is so important. Now, having said all of that, on the market-led side, there are many stumbling blocks. And very briefly, I just want to highlight a few of the things that people worry a lot about. And they vary from intellectual property being stolen, or there's allegations of this. There's the issue of the currency in China in particular. There are issues of what they call sustainability issues in the free trade agreements. So there are many of these things that have come up, and these are kind of very strong opportunities for kind of certain types of protectionism and certain kinds of delinking from this important market-led process that's occurring. My point to you is that we should not get focused on these single issue things, but we should look at the relationship in its totality, and we should attempt to foster the relationship to mutual economic gain, but try to deal with these irritants as best as we can. And three channels of dealing with these irritants. Some of these things are genuine and relevant. Some of these things are the fact that institutions in Asia, say on intellectual property, etc., are much weaker than what one might find in a mature developed market. And some of these are also cultural issues regarding some of the social issues and so on. So we have to think very carefully of these, and I'll try to suggest to you how we might look at the policy side of where we might go. Now the policy side, which I want to try to look at as we go forward, is really threefold. I want to look at a little bit of free trade agreements, which is one vehicle that can deal with some of these things. Second area is the aid for trade, and the third thing is the ASEAN process. I want to just look at these things, and my basic thesis to you on this policy side is that Europe and the UK I think need to give much more proactive attention to these positive sides and to build the relationship even stronger. And I feel the United States has started to re-engage with Asia. They're going to come in very strong, very organized, very coordinated, and I think Europe has a risk of being left behind, particularly if Europe just focuses on the negative sides of the relationship. And I think that is really the challenge for all of us. Likewise with Africa, and I'm sure Matsuma will talk a lot more about this, the Asia-African relationship needs to be looked at in a much closer sense on the positive side. Now, free trade agreements are spreading very widely in Asia, and we estimate there's something like 88 of these things in effect and many more in the pipeline, but they increasingly become a vehicle of commercial diplomacy in the absence of a Doha round and the absence of other progress on those fronts. And the ones with Europe are interesting. We have the Korea Agreement, which is expected to be the most comprehensive agreement with Asia that it has across any agreement. And that's a very important kind of benchmark that will occur. And a lot of the sustainability issues and so on were done very quickly. There are others as well, and I think the Vietnam and the India ones will be more complicated because of the sustainability issues, plus the fact that these economies essentially have limited liberalization in some key areas, and I think there are going to be some important challenges there. And we have to look very carefully at the India one and the Vietnam one in particular. The Korea one was easy because Korea is a developed country. A lot of these human rights issues don't apply. A lot of the environmental concerns, and they have introduced lots of environmental technologies from Japan and so on, and so it's much easier. These are going to be much harder. The EU-Korea is a real benchmark in many ways, even globally. And there are some of the features up there, and I won't spend much time going through this, but we can do that in the chat. It really has a lot of the really good things that you want in an agreement, and there are some storylines. Far more interesting will be Europe's engagement with the weaker countries in Asia, and I think we need to have a two-track process for the European Union to deal with Asia through free trade agreements, and I think there should be simpler adjustment periods which have transition issues built in. We should look at IPR, particularly on the development cooperation side. Even with a country like Vietnam, that becomes very important. We've got to really do a lot of capacity building, education and awareness first, and then the full chapters come in later. We need to have service liberalization in a very simple, selective manner, etc., etc. So I think these are the ways we're going to have to move with the newer agreements, particularly the LDCs and so on. So Vietnam clearly falls into this category. The second important area of our engagement with Asia is going to be through aid for trade, and I pick this as a general harbinger for the aid relationship. And I think there we have to look both at resourcing, but also European know-how in key areas which are very important. Europe is the center for information and knowledge about regional cooperation and integration. Europe has very good institutions for running market economy, and it has high-end design and services and so on. I think we have to look at this relationship in a very beneficial commercial manner. What I'm showing you on the charts is the fact that when people think about aid in Asia, they say, well, all right, Asia has India and China, they don't need any aid. That's not simply correct. I mean, Asia really has these two phases where we have India and China and Korea and Taiwan and so on. But there's also another set of countries. There are 22 LDCs in small states. There are 1.8 billion people who live on less than $2 a day, and so on. And I think there's a big need for doing some of this. And when you start comparing also, interestingly, the OECD do a lot of work on aid for trade flows, and they just look at absolute numbers, and they pick a definition of Asia that has the Middle East in it. So you have the very large region, and you look at absolute flows. And that kind of is what we call selectivity bias in any kind of economic sense. Now, when you start weighting those things by other measures, you get some very interesting numbers, and here they are. And we are producing a regional technical group report on aid for trade for the Asia Pacific, where we are trying to look at these numbers produced by the OECD and others, and trying to understand how Asia kind of fits into this new paradigm. We'll have a lot more to say about that in the autumn and in the future. So that gives you some sense of where we are. So aid for trade is very important. Aid for trade needs to be engaged in a different manner, and that's a major vehicle for Asia and Europe to engage, and Europe particularly in terms of investment. I mean, a dollar invested in aid for trade in Asia produces an enormous rate of return. I'm not going to talk about it compared to other regions, but you have some storyline there about Asia's receipt of resources. The third thing is the ASIM process, and I'm going to finish very soon, Chair. Is that the ASIM process has been a very useful first step really to engage in cooperation, and there's an attempt to engage much better. Of course, the EU has many countries there, and they've just got a new foreign policy apparatus with Baroness Ashton and so on. But overall, when you look at it, you have a sense that compared to the United States, the engagement with Asia is more limited. The United States is coming in very strong through APEC and the Trans-Pacific Agreement, and they are negotiating this free trade agreement. There's at the moment only Singapore and Brunei for Asia in this Trans-Pacific Agreement, but in the near future we may well have Vietnam, Malaysia and others wanting to join, and that could snowball as a vehicle for much closer engagement with Asia, and it could be on a region-wide basis and indeed provide some competition for the ASEAN 3 or the ASEAN 6 process, which is how Asia sees its own integration. And they're doing it in a much more systematic manner, and I suspect with the Millennium Challenge Corporation there will also be a very strong emphasis on the aid relationship through this. So the point I want to make is really that Europe needs to kind of engage much better through this ASIM process, and I think we have to do this in a much more, we have to raise the ASIM process to a much stronger official process. So the bottom line, and of course there are much better ties with China and India and so on. There's some stuff on the slide. The bottom line really is there is a lot of scope for closer economic relationships between Asia and Europe, and the UK indeed for mutual advantage. But I think we need a much more proactive approach by the UK and Europe, particularly towards Asia, and not just East Asia but Asia-wide. And I think free trade agreements, aid for trade, the ASIM processes offer very important tools in that direction. We need to explore how we might develop these things. While these things are coming about, here are some do's and don'ts. It's like the which guide to doing what with Asia. So, while the policy apparatus is kind of chugging itself and re-gearing and re-engineering itself and all of that, and in the UK we have a new government, and I understand the Foreign Secretary in his first big statement talked about better engagement with Asia as one of the priorities, amongst others, Iraq and Afghanistan and so on. But while that's all occurring, here are things that one should try to do. The first thing is really to avoid protectionism. That's very important. The green protectionism is a really big issue, and one should be careful about that, and so on and so forth. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ganesh, for that presentation.